atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, attorney and former deputy assistant to President Trump, May Mailman.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, May, how are you doing this Black Friday?
I did all of my shopping on actual Thanksgiving because I do all of my shopping online. So I feel poor this Black Friday.
Yeah. I am the same way. I have all mine done. I did mine earlier today, but it's just an overwhelming kind of experience. I'm glad it's done. I'm feeling kind of weird. I've been rewatching the Alien series of movies because the new one just came out. And then last night around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, I'm not sure what, there were these weird noises coming from underneath our deck. And I was like, I'm not going to go and check that out. But it affected my sleep for sure. These visions of creatures popping up from under the deck. Everyone was okay, but I'm not as rested as I might otherwise be. But I'm sure we'll be able to get through it no matter what. But and we do have a lot to talk about. One of the first things I was hoping we could get into is what's going to happen with all of those Donald Trump legal cases now that in a matter of, a number of weeks now, he's going to be president. And so I thought we could start by talking about that.
All right. And there are a lot of legal cases with various resolutions to them. But I think the big ones that at least we know about are, how they're going to be resolved are the ones that are from the federal government. So these are the Jack Smith cases. And so in these cases, one, you've got the January 6th cases in D.C., and then you've got the classified documents cases that were pending in the 11th Circuit out of Florida. And both of those, Jack Smith asked to be dismissed without prejudice. And the courts have accepted those motions, or at least the one in D.C. has. But they both will be. And so, the question is, what happens and why did that happen? So I think a few things. It is fairly well agreed upon that while a president is president, that you can't initiate criminal proceedings against that person. Certainly after immunity case, you at least know that. And so the question is, well, what if you've got a case that, here, you're not initiating a case. You're just, the case exists. There's a lot of questions about that, but still, Jack Smith wanted this dismissed without prejudice. And I think it's because he doesn't want loose ends there. If Jack Smith gets fired, Trump 2.0, and there are loose ends, then they're going to try and dismiss it with prejudice. And so that means that you cannot bring it back again. And so I think that Jack Smith is trying to get rid of this case in a way that will sort of insulate it and make it possible for it to zombie-like come back in the future. Now, he's got a problem there because there's a statute of limitations for 5 years. And so Trump will be in office while that statute of limitations expires. But Jack Smith put in his case, well, there's an open question about whether the statute of limitations would pause, meaning like while during those 4 years in office, those years don't count toward the statute of limitations, meaning that a future president could then appoint somebody, or just the DOJ could do it itself to bring it back to life. But that's, of course, not settled. And the fact that people are already thinking about trying to charge Trump when he's like 1 bazillion years old is a lot. But that seems to be the thing that is being set up. So that's the status of the Jack Smith cases. Jack Smith wants to be wrapped up, out of there, gone, no loose ends by the time Trump takes over. I think there are kind of a lot of loose ends to wrap up, but that's the goal there. In Georgia, there hasn't been a formal dismissal yet, the same reasoning that applies to Jack Smith applies to the cases in Georgia, in that you probably can't continue criminal cases against the president while he's president. So the only difference really in Georgia is whether they want to try and formally keep the case open, because the president can't fire those people and dismiss the case. So I think they're probably trying to think about whether they can just hold the case in abeyance or something like that, which of course I think the president would say, no, you can't, because any sort of lingering case against him where he could be held in contempt or anything like that, where you still have a judge that has jurisdiction over you, would interfere with the office of the president and interfere with the idea that you can't charge presidents for criminal acts while they're in office. So, but nothing formal has happened in the Georgia matter yet. So, Mike, are we going to see post Trump 2.0 legal actions?
God, I hope not. I'm so tired of all. No, I understand now. My friends on the left are going to say, well, we can't let him get away with it. And I understand that. I will admit that on the that's involved with Trump getting away with, that the only that I really am convinced there is the classified documents thing. And that to me, I don't know. So Smith was appointed special counsel in November of 2022, which realistically, it seems to me, gave him about 20 months or so to put a team together, bring charges, possibly secure a conviction, and then deal with, inevitable appeals. And it feels to me like Smith, to a certain extent, and also Willis, to an even greater extent in the Georgia case, tried to go too big on this and should have known about all the delays that there would be. And so if the intent was really to secure some sort of a federal conviction of Donald Trump, I feel like this was not handled very well, though you're a lot more familiar with this world than I am. I wanted to get your take on that.
So I do think that about the Georgia case for sure. If you remember, there were a ton of defendants. Everybody had their own. They wanted to split out their cases. Some people's cases were split out. There were a ton of different charges for each defendant. Some of them overlapped, some of them didn't. It was really confusing. And then let's just add, I thought it was funny, Politico on Thanksgiving had a list of people that Trump should be thankful for. And one of them, Politico said, was Fani Willis and Nathan Wade, because they decided to have a sexual relationship and add that to this mix. But Jack Smith actually, I thought, did try to do the targeted thing in the January 6th cases, where he didn't have as many charges, didn't have as many defendants as you saw in Georgia. So, could it have been even narrower? Maybe. But I think the timing issue, if you really wanted to get this in, was not from the number of claims, but was just from the delay itself. And I think, at least from conservatives, the delay itself was indicative of not having a strong case. Like, if Trump had shot somebody the day after he left office, you would have seen charges brought. But because this was kind of he gave some speeches, he made some phone calls, I don't know, in my opinion, there's no case, but at least it's novel and there's gray area. And so a lot of the pause that existed was because there wasn't a case.
Well, see, I buy that certainly for the Georgia thing, the whole RICO kind of sprawling sort of thing that always seemed a little funky to me. I certainly buy that for the New York State hush money case, where there actually was a conviction, though now sentencing is going to be postponed probably forever at this point. But it seems to me that one could make a reasonable case, just given what Donald Trump himself said about the classified documents thing. And I don't know if I were in that position, I think I would have said, let's focus on the case we know we can make, not get distracted by this other bigger stuff that's probably never going to happen. And I feel like that didn't end up happening. And so I guess on that sense, I'm a bit confused and disappointed.
Yeah, well, one of the problems in the classified documents case is Jack Smith himself, right? That who does Jack Smith answer to? Is this a constitutional body? And it's funny because special counsels are often appointed if you're investigating yourself, right? Like Robert Mueller, you have to have, because the DOJ answers to the president. So having your own person investigate you, you want to have a special counsel. You want to insulate that person a little bit. Jack Smith is a little bit unnecessary. Like, it's not like Trump works in the government. He's not Biden. And so one of the complicating factors was Jack Smith himself. And so Merrick Garland could have just raided Mar-a-Lago and just gone forth full guns a-blazing himself.
And yet, I think, though, had that been the approach that Garland would have chosen, then the response would have been, well, you're prosecuting a political opponent. You really should have appointed an outside person. So I don't really know if there's a good way to do that, which is why I was so skeptical about pursuing what seemed to me the non-clear-cut things, like I said, the New York hush money thing and everything really but the classified documents. But honestly, I feel like so much of that just became a huge sideshow, and that in my better world, not ideal world, but in my better world, one of Joe Biden's first acts on assuming the presidency would have been just to pardon Donald Trump for this, to just get it all over with, to get past this. And so we're not continually looking back on 2020. But as usual, no one in the Biden administration consulted me about that. And of course, I am deeply hurt.
I'm sorry that nobody listens to you.
You know, what am I going to do?
I think that if you run on the platform of I'm the unity president, that people were being serious. Like they thought that that's what they were getting. And then to see, if there hadn't been the Mar-a-Lago raid, I think it could have been Ron DeSantis as the nominee from the Republican side. And in that case, Ron DeSantis, awesome governor, was not that good of a politician, maybe beatable. So, yeah, I think that these prosecutions, not only are there so many loose ends to be tied up now, but I think totally backfired as a political matter.
Yeah, definitely. I mentioned pardons, and we weren't going to talk about this, but I'm just going to ask you off the cuff to get a sense of your thinking on this. But, there's been a lot of talk about whether or not Joe Biden will probably not pardon, but will at least potentially commute Hunter Biden's sentence. What do you think is going to happen there? I think that there certainly won't be a pardon, but I'm not really sure about the commutation. Well, what do you think?
I don't know. I don't think he'll do it, but I do think that Trump should do it.
Wow.
I think J.D. Vance said on some podcast that he'd really like to hang out with Hunter Biden, and it's hard to do while he's in jail. But I would like to see a Trump pardon of Hunter Biden. Do I think Biden will do it? No, I don't.
Well, that would be a bold, day one, I won't say day one, because if you follow the stuff Donald Trump said he'd do on day one, he's just going to get hand cramps from signing all the executive orders. But maybe he could fit a Hunter Biden pardon in there. That would really be something else. We'll have to watch for that. So, any other thoughts on the Trump legal cases? Like I said, my sense is that Donald Trump is not going to be sentenced for anything, and these other cases are just going to basically go by and no one's going to bring them up again in January of 2029. That's my prediction. What do you think?
I think that there will be political pressure to continue these cases. And you can already see Jack Smith said in his request to dismiss without prejudice that they sought a Department of Justice opinion on whether they could hold it over Donald Trump's head for 4 years. It says the special counsel's office sought OLC's guidance on whether this case must be dismissed or whether the pending superseding indictment could be held in abeyance until he's no longer immune from prosecution. So you already have this quote unquote independent person wanting to do that. If the independent person wants to do that, can you imagine what a partisan person would want to do. So I think there's going to be tremendous pressure to revive this.
Well, if I hope we are still here, I plan on still being here in January of 2029, and we'll have to revisit that, but it's going to be a while. So why don't we stop there and move on to our next story, a policy issue, tariffs. I have a lot of thoughts about tariffs, and I haven't been shy in sharing them, but let me just say, I'm guessing that if I asked you what the most beautiful word in the English language is, you probably wouldn't say tariffs, right? Would you?
I don't know. No, I mean, if you were going to say there is no income tax and instead this country is going to make its money on tariffs, I would be absolutely willing to have that conversation.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, as you know, I mean, and listeners probably know too, President-elect Trump does think that tariffs, at least has said that tariff is the most beautiful word in the language. And it seems a pretty safe bet to say that one of the first things he will do when in office again is to slap a bunch of tariffs on a bunch of countries. And for instance, this week, he promised that on the first day of his term, he would put in place a 25% tariff on all products from Mexico and Canada. And in his Truth Social post in which he announced this, he said, this tariff will remain in effect until such time as drugs, in particular fentanyl, and all illegal aliens stop this invasion of our country. Both Mexico and Canada have the absolute right and power to easily solve this long simmering problem. We hereby demand that they use this power, and until such time as they do, it's time for them to pay a very big price. And on that same day, he announced an additional 10% tariff on all goods from China until Beijing follows through on what Donald Trump says was a promise to put the death penalty on the drug dealers who were involved in sending fentanyl to the United States, or actually more accurately, the precursor chemicals that go from China to Mexican drug cartels and then into the United States. And I should point out that in his first term, Trump did make some headway on this. He did get China to agree to crack down on their companies that actually send the fentanyl itself to Mexico, but then they just sort of shifted gears and said, okay, we'll just send the precursors and kind of get around that sort of thing. But progress in this area has been slowed in part because of U.S. support for Taiwan. There was back in the summer of 2022, after then House Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan, the Chinese government suspended all of its counter-narcotics cooperation with us. And it wasn't until August of this year that China announced that it would, in fact, be imposing stricter regulations on three chemical precursors for fentanyl. And as I mentioned, a big part of the problem here is that even if those bans or restrictions are honored, producers can still get around them by just slightly altering the molecular structure, the composition of those precursors. And Chinese officials don't want to be overly broad in their restrictions because that could possibly hamper the export of chemicals that aren't necessarily being used to manufacture illegal drugs. Now, in response to all this, Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, said that her country would respond to any U.S. tariffs with retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods coming into Mexico. And she pointed out that, oh, by the way, U.S. automakers have a pretty significant manufacturing presence in Mexico, and that auto plants on both sides of the border tend to work fairly closely together. So tariffs on one side would likely affect what companies on the other side or plants on the other side, the U.S. side, could actually do. She also mentioned that the flow of migrants at the southern border has slowed considerably, citing Border Patrol stats that show the crossings are down something like 75% from the same time last year, and said, look in the mirror, United States, essentially. You got these big problems sending all these guns to us in Mexico that are used by the cartel. It's a demand side problem more than a supply side problem. But then I guess things got a little friendlier during a phone conversation she had with Trump. Now, accounts vary as to what happened as a result of that conversation. Trump said she's agreed to stop migration through Mexico and into the United States, effectively closing our southern border. And Sheinbaum said, no, actually, that's not what I said. But I did say that we would work on these issues while still respecting human rights. And then there's Canada, which came out of nowhere, it seems. I mean, they've been taking a much less aggressive stance, basically saying, hey, we're better than Mexico on this stuff. And Prime Minister Trudeau actually spoke to Donald Trump earlier this week as well about Canada's plans to further secure its border. And like I said, they've been pointing out that we're much more on your side than Mexico with China tariffs things. Canadian Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland said, we're very aligned with this U.S. administration on the issue of China. So a lot of tariff talk from Donald Trump, not surprising at all. May, what do you think? Do you think he'll end up following through on the Mexico, Canada, and China tariffs? Or is this just sort of a negotiating strategy, especially given the fact that there's still a ways to go before he gets into office on January 20th?
Blinds.com's Black Friday sales event is happening now with our best deals of the season. Let our design experts help you make the perfect selection for your home on your schedule. We can send free samples right to you and handle everything from measure to install. With over 25 million windows covered, Blinds.com is the #1 online retailer of custom window coverings. Save up to 50% site-wide, plus doorbusters, and a free professional measure at the Blinds.com Black Friday sales event now. Rules and restrictions may apply.
I think that he says it with the intent of following through. That said, things can always change and negotiations. President Trump is the king of negotiating. So negotiations can always happen. And, to the extent some of this has to be implemented in phases because it requires the Department of Commerce to do various studies or the USTR to put forth various papers, depending on the legal tools that are used, there is time for those negotiations. But if some of it has to go to Congress, then you've got problems there too. So there's just lots of ifs, ands, or buts. But to the question of, is Trump serious? He's absolutely serious. And he thinks that tariffs is a beautiful word for a lot of reasons, not just the beauty of the word itself, but I think when you think of what it's capable for. So countries do have to make money. And like I kind of joked, well, are we getting rid of the income tax? I think there is this idea that, well, what if instead of taxing the productivity of American people, you were taxing the cost of goods coming in? And so you're incentivizing people to be productive here in the United States. Everything is much more difficult in practice than it is in theory. But theoretically, that's an idea, I think, that can have some buy-in. And it was the way that the U.S. used to largely operate and the way that other countries do operate. Like I said, a lot of problems in implementation. The other is when you think about the U.S.'s power, a lot of people want to sell to us because we are a wealthy country. So what do strong leaders do with their nation's power? They try and leverage it. How do we leverage the U.S.'s economic strength? I think for such a long time, it's like, well, we're going to leverage it by giving giveaways, right? Like we're going to fund the World Bank in various places. We're going to fund handouts across the globe. We're going to build democracy. We're going to give all these handouts. Well, what's another way to leverage your purchasing power that can help the strength of your country? Maybe that's tariffs. And so maybe we were spending a little bit less on giveaways and a little bit more on establishing this tariff structure. You actually wouldn't, be poorer. You would have the same amount of money. You'd just be reallocating it to different things. And I think then there's just this huge national security piece to it, which is right now the U.S. depends on other countries for things that we absolutely need, like penicillin. I think, and during COVID, people realize this a little bit more, and trying to fix that is really important, and tariffs can be part of that. So there's so many pieces of a national puzzle where tariffs fit in. There's questions about implementation. There's questions about near-term financial costs, questions about practicality, all these questions. But I think people, on the other hand, one hand, tariff's a beautiful word. On the other hand, some people write it off without really thinking, how can we use them beneficially? And I think the correct answer is probably somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I I think tariff is a lot less beautiful word. And in fact, I prefer income tax to tariff, though I have my problems with income tax. And for one big reason, and the big reason is that tariffs are regressive. They're not a progressive tax. And, this is one thing that I think Kamala Harris, you can argue with the branding of it, but it will, in fact, be, in a sense, a national sales tax, and it will be regressive as opposed to an income tax. And this is not like some crazy out there view. Economists left, right, and center, almost everyone except for, it seems like, Donald Trump seems to accept that these tariffs the cost of these tariffs will be passed on to consumers. And so it seems weird. Either he is completely economically incoherent, which I don't believe, which is why I end up believing that he thinks that this threat is going to get these countries to give the United States something in return. Like, for instance, in his first term, when he made a similar threat to Mexico and leveraged that to get Mexico to agree to the Remain in Mexico policy for asylum seekers. And so that's why I see that being a lot more of a plausible scenario. That and the fact that I know Donald Trump cares a lot about the markets, what the markets do. And if markets tank or inflation goes up as a result of tariffs, he'll back away from that pretty quickly. And so I see this, I hope I'm right here, as much more of a ploy, because I think the national security stuff aside, which is, I think you're right, a very important thing, which is why I think the Bipartisan CHIPS Act was a good idea, not nearly enough, but things along those lines are good. But I don't think we're going to end up with those tariffs. And I think if we do, it's going to be problematic, because then it puts Donald Trump in a position of, if China and Mexico and Canada call his bluff, that puts him in a position where Donald Trump's not a guy who backs away from stuff. He's much more of a double downer. And I could see that putting him between a rock and a hard place.
So there are a lot of issues where I would say popular opinion weighs pretty heavily, things that President Trump has not dedicated his life to, and he's not just going to take the Republican stance, whatever, like that public opinion, markets, these types of things, he's very sensitive to. I just don't think tariffs are one of them. I think there was a really big question during the first Trump go around of, are tariffs leverage or are tariffs an end in themselves? Are they good public policy? And I think a lot of people like tariffs because they're leverage and defend them because of that. And certainly they're used as that. And that is one of the benefits. But I also think that Trump thinks tariffs are good in themselves, which doesn't mean you do everything that's good in itself. Like, there are reasons, if the deal that you get is good enough, you bypass it. But this is the one issue that I would say is like real. This isn't public opinion. This isn't markets. This is real. And so if I were Mexico, if I were Canada, and I was trying to figure out, like, is this bluffing? My answer would be, my best guess is it's not.
Well, I guess my thinking is that, given the fact that border encounters are way down over the last year or two, and not only that, but we see border encounters, that's obviously one big issue that he has. Not only that, but fentanyl deaths, are actually down. In fact, fentanyl deaths increased by an average of 32% per year under Donald Trump, only around 10% per year under Joe Biden. So I think what this gives Donald Trump an opening to do is to say, listen, I went in there, I got tough, I made these threats, and look at the numbers. Fentanyl deaths are way down, and immigration is way down. Why? I did this for you. And so I think that's his out. I don't think he's going to do any of this. Now, maybe that's just me, because I think that tariffs, these kind of broad-based tariffs, are a horrible idea, which is why it's a very different thing than the sort of national security things that you were alluding to earlier. And so, I mean, that's to me my take, is what he cares about in terms of policy is that it doesn't really make sense to me saying that he would think that tariffs are good in and of themselves, because tariffs are a tool. And so the question is, I guess, to me, is what does he want them to accomplish? Well, I think he wants them to help increase the U.S. manufacturing base, to decrease immigration, illegal immigration, and to decrease drugs coming into these countries. Well, two of those three things are already happening. And the third thing would take years, if not decades, to happen, because it's not like a company can say, oh, he put in place tariffs, I guess we'll just go ahead and move to Alabama from Shanghai or something like that next week. This is a long process. So that's why I guess I'm a little more than a little bit skeptical. But you said many times on the show that tariffs are one of these things that you feel are kind of like an article of faith for Donald Trump. But I wonder if he puts them in place and it doesn't work the way he thinks they're going to do, what happens then? Because it seems to me an even bigger article of faith for Donald Trump is that Donald Trump is never wrong about anything.
Well, it's hard to know exactly when they're working as they're supposed to. Like,
sure.
At what moment in time do you measure the impact? And so if the goal, like, because I laid out a lot of goals, right? There's a national security goal. There's a potential moving away from the income tax goal, self-sufficiency goal, reward people who build jobs in the U.S. goal, but ultimately a increased manufacturing jobs in the United States goal. So if the tariffs come first and the manufacturing job comes a year later, you can't measure the effectiveness of the tariff before then. Like measuring you're I guess asking for some self-reflection that on an unclear timeline. So that's the thing. Like, yet it doesn't matter if the cost of a T-shirt goes from whatever you can get it at Walmart, $5 to, let's just say, double, $10, not even 20%, double that. If you're making, currently $50,000, but because of an influx in manufacturing, including pharmaceutical manufacturing, all these types of things, now you're making $80,000. You don't care. You don't even need that shirt. That shirt was stupid. Now you're paying $0. You don't even care. So I don't know, like measuring the impact of tariffs, I think economists like to think of things as very black and white of, what people are purchasing. But I think that there's a very different way to measure the economy of a sort of well-being. And I think that that's a little bit harder to measure. So, I don't know what's going to happen. I think it'll be very interesting for years, but the only thing that I can say here is that this is a real commitment.
It's interesting to me because it seems like on so many issues, and this drives people on the left nuts, and probably you guys on the right get a good laugh out of this, but the things that it seems like got Donald Trump elected, right? High prices, immigration, the drug issue, the fentanyl issue maybe was one as well that kind of tied in with immigration. All those things are getting better just at the time he's coming in. And so it's going to be really easy for him if he just doesn't screw them up to essentially take credit for trends that are already happening and kind of make himself look better for the work that a lot of us on the left feel that Joe Biden actually did. And I guess that's just one of those things that sometimes happen. And so, but in the end, I think Donald Trump is not a long-term thinker. And I think you might be right that, you could argue that maybe 5, 10, 15 years down the road, certain tariffs make sense. I find it really hard to believe that if he puts these tariffs in place, the markets tank, inflation goes up by 3 or 4%, that he just says, well, that's just too bad because here I make my stand. He strikes me as so much more a transactional sort of guy as opposed to a stand on my principles sort of guy. That's kind of my take, but you know him better than I do, for sure.
And nobody really knows, but
yeah.
I guess looking at who we have as USTR, Jamison Greer, who was the chief of staff after Robert Lighthizer, very smart guy, and implemented tariffs in a smart fashion against China after a Section 301 investigation. That's a legal process. Jamison Greer is a lawyer, gets it. So I think there's a smart person who can implement tariffs in a targeted fashion. And then Scott Bessent, who will be the the Treasury Secretary. I think that he also is somebody who has gone on TV and made the case for tariffs, but in his case, a lot more for the leverage piece. So I'd also be looking for public statements from those two to kind of see where you think things are going to go.
In terms of the practicalities of it, most people who have studied this would say that, well, it would mean pulling out of the USMCA treaty that Donald Trump negotiated as a replacement for NAFTA. And that went into effect in the summer of 2020. It was negotiated before that, though. And that treaty actually does have a provision that allows any of the three signatories, U.S., Mexico, or Canada, to withdraw with 6 months' notice. Now, I'm not clear, and Donald Trump hasn't made it clear, if he would actually do that. And so therefore the tariffs would not necessarily take effect until after that 6 months, because the tariffs, as he explained those, now obviously this is just in a True Social post, so we don't have a lot of detail, but these tariffs would seem to violate the terms of the USMCA. And so therefore to actually put those in place, the U.S. would have to withdraw, which would give even more time. That's at least my read of the actual policy part of this. Is that kind of going in line with how you see it?
So, not a trade lawyer, so I'm not exactly sure. But so either you could redo the USMCA to have different rules, which of course Trump did at one time, so he could do it again. Alternatively, the USMCA has dispute resolution mechanisms, so it can be honored in the breach and you can pay for it later. But yeah, the USMCA is definitely going to be something to contend with here.
And there are some folks who would say, well, that's kind of problematic in that then our foreign, not adversaries, but our other governments then would see this and say, well, why should we enter into any agreement with the United States if the United States will only honor its agreement so long as it is maximally beneficial for the United States and pull. In other words, you can't trust the United States at its word. And so therefore that hurts our international standing. I don't get the sense Donald Trump gives a rip about our international standing, but I'd like your take on that.
I think he does care about our international standing because I think he thinks that leaders should all be committed to the best interests of their own countries. And so if you're another country and you're offering the U.S. a deal that actually is going to have benefit to the U.S., then the U.S. is going to take it. But if it's a deal that doesn't, and so President Trump, I think, would say that we've entered into a lot of especially multilateral agreements where the U.S. is using its money in order to be a giver rather than an equal partner where both parties are benefited. And so if you're another country, of course, the U.S. can always renegotiate, can always change its mind, but they won't do it if the deal is actually good for them. So it's like it's an untrustworthy trading partner in one sense, but it's a very trustworthy trading partner if you just assume that people are going to do what's in their best interest and you make sure that deals are in the U.S. best interest. And, that type of behavior, I should hope, is what we would want our leaders to go into. Maybe this is too erratic for people, but I think that if there are deals that don't have the U.S. best interest in mind, we should be trying to figure out what to do about that.
So, bold predictions on here. Donald Trump said on January 20th, so first day in office, he said, it's one of my many first executive orders. I counted at one point, and there was like 40-something things he was going to do on day one. And of course, that's really only kind of an afternoon. I guess you could sign the papers maybe beforehand. I don't know how that dating of it works exactly. It's going to be a full day, is my point. Do you think this is actually going to be a day one? This reminds me of what Jay loves to say, and so many people take him seriously, not literally. And I'm wondering if you actually literally think that on day one, there will be an executive order for these tariffs, or if you think this is just kind of a seriously, not literally sort of thing.
Well, I guess even in that question, there's a lot there because executive orders don't, there are a range of executive orders. There are executive orders that say this is happening right now. Travel ban no longer can, if you are from China, you can't come into the U.S. because it's COVID. This is an executive order. Or there are executive orders that say, I really like tariffs. USTR and Commerce, go do some things. So do I think that there will be an executive order? I would put that on the range of likely. Do I think that all of a sudden in 3 months that's going to close the border. I don't know. Like, I think that now we're in the range of trade lawyering, where what are the various legal tools? How can they be used? Because a lot of the tools that were used, Trump 1.0, which I do know more about, so Section 232 for steel, for example, that Biden continued, these are things that require a robust agency interaction, because there have to be legal bases for example, the amount of steel coming in at the price that steel is coming in is harming our manufacturing. And if you put a tariff at this level, it would increase it. So it really then depends on the legal tool. But you could obviously say something in an executive order on day one. So I'm going to go with yes.
And I'll make one final point on this before we move on, is that, there are so many things about Donald Trump that I do not like, and I think rightly so. But I'll point out that at least on the issue of certain tariffs, that Joe Biden has actually continued a lot of the Trump first-term policy. And I actually think, again, if tariffs are targeted, especially towards strategic industries, and you mentioned the example of COVID, but also a lot of military applications, I think we absolutely should be looking at that. But I think that if Donald Trump does, in fact, on day one, put in place tariffs, and I think I tend to agree with you that there will be some kind of executive order. If they're as sweeping as he says they'll be in this tweet, it's going to be a disaster, and he's going to have to pull back from that, and that'll be interesting to see how that happens. So we shall see. All right,
we shall.
Yeah, we have time for one more thing, a very, very different kind of thing. I saw just this last week, Walmart made an announcement about rolling back some of its DEI policies, and I thought that'd be worth talking about. I know this is an issue that you've thought a lot about in certain ways, and so I thought we'd get into that to kind of close out this weekend show.
Yeah, so I think you saw the rise of DEI after the murder of George Floyd. Companies, according to a McKinsey study, spent an estimated $7.5 billion on DEI-related efforts, and I think that is under-inclusive. And, now, for whatever reason, I think you can point to a lot of things, the economy being less hot. Maybe companies aren't seeing that they got anything out of the $7.5 billion. I was trying to figure out whether the wage gap between white workers and black workers have closed at all, or whether race relations, what has changed with that investment. I couldn't find anything very clearly. And then you see massive, I think, political pushback. So at least in this last election, it seemed like there was some indication of a vote against wokeness, whether that be transgenderism, whether that be terms like Latinx. And then you have legal pressure. So not only did the Supreme Court say that no longer can universities say that diversity is a need that will allow them to discriminate on the basis of race. So you can give certain good reasons under the Constitution, compelling government interest in order to discriminate on the basis of race. One of those compelling interests can't be like, I like diversity, and when it used to be. And so what does that mean for private companies? Because those lawsuits are coming. They are already coming. They've been able to, so far, a little bit stay under the radar, get dismissed on standing, things like that. But those lawsuits aren't going to stop anytime soon. So all this to say that Walmart is now not a leader. They're just one of the companies, but a huge company, a nearly $1 trillion company, to announce that it is going to wind down some of its DEI-related efforts. It's not going to use words like Latinx or DEI. Instead, it's going to use words like belonging. It's not going to give contracts on the basis of race or sex anymore, or at least it says it's not going to do that. It's going to end this racial equity center. So that said, I'm sure there still will be a lot of DEI-related efforts going on at Walmart. They're just not going to call it that. So I don't know if they're necessarily in the clear. We'll see what they actually mean by scaling back on some of these things. But I do think that it shows a pretty big shift in the landscape post the 2020. Mike, yeah, what are your thoughts?
Well, I guess the term DEI, I hate the term because it encompasses, it's such a broad term, at least it's been taken to encompass so much that I don't even know what it means. And there are some things that fall under that umbrella that I think are okay. And there are some things I think are less okay. Like, is DEI giving priority treatment to suppliers who are minorities, women, veteran-owned businesses? Well, yeah, that's part of it. Part of it is, things like contributing to those various funds that do stuff, right? And that, okay. And then there's bias training. There's using certain, there's so much. And I think some of those things are maybe useful things to do. Like in the pre-George Floyd BLM era, there was DEI. It wasn't really called that, but it mostly involved, I guess, what you'd call unconscious bias training. And that's a real thing. And I think I don't have any big problems with a reasonable amount of what I'd call non-judgmental awareness training, just to try to get people to understand where other people from other groups, how they see the world and their experience. I think that can be a good and healthy thing. I think it becomes problematic when it kind of changes in the ways it did post BLM, post George Floyd, into a sort of a very judgmental, kind of harassing sort of, by the way, this is systematic bias, and just by being a white male, you are a bad person sort of thing. And I think that's where it goes really over the line. And that, I think, is the sort of DEI that when people think about it, they say, yeah, that's just too much. But the other stuff, I think there's something to it. But there's another part in that a lot of this training has been proven to be not only not that effective, but in some cases actually counterproductive, which isn't surprising, because if you get a bunch of people in the room for an hour and tell them how bad they are for being, what they are, well, then of course they're going to just say, well, screw you, buddy. And so I think it's problematic for a number of reasons. And the biggest reason maybe for people on the left should be, it doesn't seem like it's working. And it's like, what if we yell at people that they shouldn't be racist and they're still being racist? Maybe if we yell at them more and longer, that will help. Well, no, that's not going to help. So that's kind of my take on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. So one of these, I did watch the documentary by Matt Walsh, Am I a Racist? And I think that I didn't really love the movie. I think it had a great possibility. I loved his What is a Woman movie. And I thought this one, they were trying too hard to be Jackass, playing pranks
Yeah.
and not trying enough to expose what's going on. But there was some exposure there. And what I thought was very interesting is that these very uneducated people, they went into biker bars that had Confederate flags flying inside of them. And they asked these people, some of whom, just all these people, about what they thought about race, equality, all those things. And it's the answers that you would expect for somebody who had gone through an unconscious bias training, right? Like, these are people who genuinely are like biker buddies with anyone and everyone. And then fast forward, you'd go to these sort of hoity-toity anti-racist trainings, and everyone viewed everything through the lens of race. And not only that, there was a huge, what I think Matt Walsh would call, grift component to it, where there are a lot of people making, when companies say they're spending $7.5 billion, they're not just paying underrepresented minorities. They're paying consultants. They're paying white people to advise them on their various things. And those people are selling books and all that. So I think there's another portion where it's like, okay, slavery did exist. Obviously, there are racial inequities following slavery that existed, and there's we need to recognize that. We need to make sure that there are no vestiges of that. But there's a big difference between trying to be an equal society and trying to be an equitable society. And I do think that there's a grift component to this equity thing that I don't think that this anti-racist really captured. but that maybe some of these companies are starting to realize.
Yeah, and I also think and you hit on this a little bit earlier on, I think companies are a lot more concerned about potential legal exposure. And I mean, you mentioned, there's the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there's the Equal Protection Clause. There are also, I know, some arguments, I think, that have focused on breach of fiduciary duty, hostile work environment. I think there's like a Title VII of the Civil Rights Act kind of gets into that, compelled speech. And I think a lot of companies' legal departments look at this and say, listen, there are a lot of conservative groups who are pushing back hard on this, not just, on X, but actually in the courts. And do we really want to expose ourselves to this, especially when it seems like our employees hate it and it doesn't really actually seem to be doing a whole lot of good? We're not accomplishing what we want to accomplish. And so that's a pretty compelling reason to rethink what you're doing, at least for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say so. You don't want to be the named party in the case that goes to the Supreme Court that says that, no, you can't just give, if you're governed by Title VII, you can't just give someone a contract because of their race. Like, that violates Title VII. And, it is a little bit hard sometimes for individual plaintiffs to say that they weren't given a promotion because of their race, right? Like, if you've got a company that has a goal of 50% of its, upper staff being Black, and if you're white, like, how do you prove whether I should have been promoted but for that 50% goal? So, like, the lawsuits are difficult, and so, but they're not impossible. And at some point, there's going to be a smoking gun. Like, the email is going to come out, and people, I think, are probably tired of trying to make that when they know that they actually are putting a thumb on the scale, but they can't really say so on email. It just gets really sticky. And so why not just hire not based on race?
I guess to me, and this is going to sound like such an old white guy sort of thing to say. And I'm sure I'll get response to this, but it's hard for me to understand why this is so difficult, why it would take $8 billion, that's the number I saw, $7.5, $8 billion in consultants, when so much of it, to me, at least in my work life, boiled down to not being a jerk. There's a book, an old book called The Idea of a University, written by Cardinal Newman back in 1852. So an old book. And one of the things he focused on were the qualities of a gentleman. This would apply to men or women. And what he said is, a gentleman is somebody who never inflicts pain. He tries to make everyone at ease and feel at home, tender toward the bashful, gentle toward the distant, merciful toward the absurd. And I read that and I think, there's your DEI training. And it seems to me that this isn't just an ivory tower thing. I mean, when I was in classrooms with trans kids, they would come up to me and occasionally and say, listen, I go by whatever, Jenny now. And I'd be like, okay, I'll make a note. I'll call you Jenny. It's not a big deal. And I didn't need training. It just seems to me and I feel like I got to be missing something, but it seems to me just like a basic human decency kind of thing. But so many people are telling me that there's so much more to it. And I got to say, maybe I am just this clueless old white guy who doesn't understand this privilege, but that just kind of where I come down on this. I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny. So when I was in Teach for America, the second year through my school, we did one of these types of trainings, but it wasn't on race. It was on class. And so it said, it made you first take a quiz. Would you know how to get food if you had no money, or like to figure out if you're high class? Like, would you know how to hire an interior decorator if you needed to? And so you took this quiz, and then it walked you through, here are the values and the lifestyle choices of people who are lower class, middle class, upper class. And I still think about it. So it's like, well, obviously this training must have done something. And yet it didn't talk about race. And I think that that's important, because when I read J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, I felt like a lot of the things that he was talking about of choices that people were making in his community were a lot of the same things that I experienced in my classroom. And so one of the other problems I feel like with all of this DEI is that it condenses poverty and class into race, and it makes a lot of assumptions that I think are racist. And so maybe there is room for training, but making everything a race thing is, I think, I'm glad, I very much applaud Walmart for getting away from this. And I'll just bring up one other thing from the North Carolina Supreme Court case when it came up, which is if they would have done class-based affirmative action rather than race-based, North Carolina specifically rejected that because it actually would have increased the number of white students because their low-class people who were applying to North Carolina were poor white kids from North Carolina. And so there was a desire specifically to reject poverty and class and to instead focus on race. And these types of things, I think, are blatantly illegal. I think the companies know that they are cruising to a decision to that end. And hopefully that, if Walmart wants to continue to do things to help people who need help, there certainly is an opportunity for that. They just don't have to do it purely based on race.
I think there's something to that, certainly that race and class can sort of overlap in certain ways. And I also feel like there is room for at least basic awareness sort of thing, but it has to be done very carefully. It's a tough balancing act because it seems to me, and this is a very small sample, but most of the people I've known who've been kind of involved in this sort of training as a profession tend to be what I would call activists. And so they tend to be, again, in my experience, fairly aggressive and kind of pushing a lot on these sort of things when I think that that's just a counterproductive way of looking at things. And I have found certainly in my life that having awareness without being sort of judged as being bad actually has opened my eyes. And I think that can be effective, whether it's class or race or gender, because I think it is true that if you're a young black man, your worldview is probably going to be in certain ways different than if you're a young Hispanic woman or an old white guy or something like that. And it's good to know that, but finding a way to do that doesn't essentially involve, well, for lack of a better term, reverse discrimination or, condemning a group simply for being part of that group, that can be pretty tricky. And I don't think we figured it out yet. Well, on that note, why don't we end things? And if you have listened to this point, I hope it means that you care about what we're doing. And if you do care about what we're doing and you're not a supporter, we hope you consider becoming one. It's quick and easy and simple to do. I always put the links there in the show notes. We would really appreciate you get access to the full midweek episode, not just that brief preview that we put out. Our Discord group, which has just been, like I said, blowing up since the election, all kinds of stuff going on, even some, non-political sort of fun stuff. All of that, check it out. We hope you will. And even if you don't want to do that, if you could just rate and review us, that would be awesome. We would really appreciate that on your podcast app. And if you want to get that full midweek show, but you're not in a position to financially support us, send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that all set up for you. And finally, as always, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producers. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,